Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this research that the FRC is publishing today alongside the London Business School Leadership Institute and SQW. We're very proud to present this research today. My name's David Stiles, and I'm Director of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the FRC. With me today, I have Vyla Rollins, who's Executive Director of the Leadership Institute, Randall Peterson, who's the Academic Director of the Institute, have Osman Anwar from SQW, and we have Sergei Plekhanov, who's a Managing Consultant at the SQW as well. Now, the format for today is that I'm going to just very briefly introduce, and you'll see that there's a Q&A function there too, so please, when the presenters are presenting and you get questions that come to mind, please put them in there, because after we've had the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session, which we hope will be lively. So I encourage you to listen and input into the Q&A. Thanks very much indeed. Briefly, a little bit about the FRC and why we commissioned this research. As I said, the FRC, I'm David Stiles, I'm Director of Corporate Governance and Stewardship, and we're responsible for, one of the things my team is responsible for is the UK Corporate Governance Code. Now, the code's been around for a while, and one of the key issues around the code is how do we make boards effective decision-making bodies? That's not just what the code is about. The code, as we amended in 2018, is wider than that. But one of the central issues to the code is the effectiveness of boards and how they make decisions. Because those decisions affect the company, and of course, they affect the economy, they affect wider society, and hopefully they improve performance of companies, and that improves the performance of the economy and wider society, and brings benefits to wider society as well through sustainable long-term value creation. So that's why we think diversity is important, because diversity is absolutely central to those issues. It's to effective boards, effective companies, and sustainable value creation. Now, since 2010, the code has coordinated with what was then the Lord Davis Review of gender diversity on boards. It subsequently became the Hampton-Alexander Review, and more recently the Parker Review of Black and ethnic minority representation on boards as well. Now that's been key to what we've been doing with the code, and in the code, the 2018 code, we introduced a principle on diversity that took diversity and inclusion to a much broader aspect. Gender is important, ethnicity is important, but other forms of diversity and inclusion are important as well, particularly social and economic background, and different types of cognitive strengths as well. That's why we're interested in the research that we commissioned, because what we were interested to see was a quantitative and a qualitative aspect of diversity. So how do you go about getting diverse boards in the broadest sense? How do those diverse boards actually improve decision making through constructive challenge in the boardroom and getting a better discussion? And what is the outcome of that? How does that lead to better performance by companies and all the benefits that can bring to the economy and society? So we went through a very rigorous process in terms of discussing and deciding what we wanted from the search, and I was very pleased that the London Business School and SQW was successful in their application. So that's enough from me. We've got some really interesting results today. Immediately, I'm going to hand over to Vyla Rollins, and then Vyla will hand over to her colleagues to present the results of the research. So Sarah, if you could put the slides up on the screen, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. You've just heard about some of the primary aims that the FRC had for this research initiative. However, as you'll hear in the next 40 to 45 minutes, we also had a number of secondary aims we're keen to pursue in the research. including a desire to help boards deepen their understanding about how they can move past the conceptualization of the business case for diversity, stimulating thinking and discussion about the multiple types of diversity that exist, and more importantly, provide insights to help boards develop even more effective and impactful strategies to cultivate and maximize the value add diversity can bring to the boardroom discussions and decisions. Let me briefly say a bit more about what we mean about moving past the business case argument for diversity. Over the past 20 years, we've seen the case made multiple times for the value a diverse board brings to an organization as well as its stakeholders. This is often referred to as the business case for diversity. Now, in the early days, this was seen as a business-focused way of addressing the diversity and inclusion opportunities manifesting. That said, research over the past 15 years has shown that promoting the business case argument can be problematic because it places an added burden on marginalized groups that is simply not the same as those who don't experience inequities. This reality is exacerbated by the fact that that increasing the numbers of underrepresented constituencies on your board or in your organization does not automatically produce benefits. So to reap the benefits of the multiple aspects of diversity, one of the critical factors required is the active and mindful facilitation of diverse groups in order to unlock those benefits. So my colleagues and I are very keen to help the continued, let's say, reorientation of the conversation, moving away from the question of whether diversity is helpful or not, and towards the question of what are the ways diversity can be facilitated or cultivated in an effective and value-added way in the boardroom. I will now pass over to my colleague, Randall Peterson, who will start to share some of the key insights emerging from our work, things that were, as well as things that were reinforced for us as part of the research effort. Over to you, Randall.
All right, thank you, Vyla. We were and are very enthusiastic about this research. We agreed just world-class standards for research, which take more time, more investment, but they yield better quality results. So we're excited about that. And of course, we're excited to do the work on diversity. It's a powerful force, one that can transform economies, societies, businesses. Manage it well, massive benefits. Manage it poorly, and it becomes a source of conflict or sometimes, not in a good way. So what we've done, we're going to start here with really just thinking about or seeing what boards think about how they define diversity. So if we can go to the next slide, we're going to start here with how directors are thinking about diversity. This was actually one of the, I think, an interesting point as we got into it. So if we could go to the next slide then. Our first bit of data here, this is showing us about why boards actually diversify. So what's behind, when boards do decide to diversify, is it because it's a mandate, it's a target? Is it because we think it will genuinely help us make better decisions? Is it to better represent our customers and so on? Now, what you'll see here, building on the point that Vyla made, is that the number one category is about making better business decisions. So it's the business case reasons why boards choose to diversify. And as you go down the list, you start to see some of the other reasons that boards diversify that reflect some of the other reasons for diversity that we've seen over time. But the primary one remains the business case. All right, let's go to the next slide, because we asked boards, how do you define diversity? And we allowed them to share absolutely anything they'd like. And what you'll see here is that and this is percentage of what people talked about. So individual personality, neurodiversity, individual skills is definitely is decidedly the top getter, followed by gender, which is not a surprise since there's a lot of conversation about that right now, followed by race. Again, if you these are the conversations that have been having about diversity over the last decade in particular. So we're not surprised by any of that. But what we wanted to do was to find out, not just reflecting what's going on out there, what do individual directors think are the most important aspects in diversity, for example, and what do they mention first, for example. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that again, this has individual personality, neurodiversity, individual skills, again, as the top vote getter. So if you're thinking about what do boards think about diversity, they think in terms of individuals. They think in terms of bringing specific skill sets as the primary mechanism or understanding of what diversity is about and how they like to use it or how they think about it. So last slide in this series here, one more slide, please. We'll see, which are the ones that are most emphasized here. And again, what you see is that individual level one, again, is by far the most important here. So directors define diversity primarily by individual rather than by group, okay? Despite the fact that that many of the targets, for example, are by group. So there's a little bit of mismatch between the way boards think about diversity and the way, say, the FRC is thought about diversity, and how probably many parts of the public also think about it. And what they consider most important is individual skills. So with that as the starting point, I want to hand over to my colleague, Osman Anwar, who's going to talk about the research methods that underpin some of the details of this research.
Thank you, Randall. Could we move to the next slide, please? And the next one. Right, so in examining the link between board diversity and effectiveness in FTSE 350 companies, we really used a combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches. And that really took into account two key aspects I would highlight. The first one is around bringing in sort of longer term effects, medium and longer term effects, rather than just looking at an immediate effect in increasing diversity. The second one is about board dynamics, so allowing key insights from board members on defining, managing, and developing diversity, as Randall sort of hinted on there. I would like to highlight that the approach was systematic, iterative. The quant and qual elements really sort of were used in combination to inform each other rather than seen as separate research strands. So with that in mind, the key sort of methods that we used were going to take a literature review, looking at diversity and firm performance. And the results there, the findings from the existing literature is quite mixed. Some is positive, some is negative, there are no relationships between diversity and firm performance. But the literature kind of helped us to inform our approach to the statistical analysis, the statistical modeling work that we undertook, which covered the FTSE companies. So this really covered three different but quite complementary measures of board effectiveness, which were EBITDA margin, stock returns, and shareholder dissent. And so we examined data over 20 years based on secondary data sets. And just a few things to highlight on the statistical analysis work is, naturally, the relationship between diversity and effectiveness is quite complex, and the influence can go both ways. So if diversity may make a board more effective, but at the same time, an effective board can seek to be more diverse as well. So in order to address that issue, we took steps to isolate the effects of diversity on effectiveness as far as practically possible to do so. And the preliminary statistical analysis that we did also helped inform the interviews, which were really the fascinating piece in the methods that we use. So we did in-depth online interviews with a representative sample of 25 FTSE companies. That involved interviews with 71 board directors, so on average 3 interviews per organisation, including the chair. The idea there was to get multiple views. So one person's view about diversity and effectiveness may be different from another, even from the same board. And it was important to get those multiple perspectives. The interview results provided key insights on diversity and board dynamics. It helps improve our understanding of the quant analysis by drawing on additional variables that could be included in the statistical analysis as well. But in the whole process, the unique and I would say fascinating feature in all of this in the interview process was the use of the board effectiveness profile, the Q-sort method, which has been developed by Randall Peterson. And I've hand back to Randall to just talk a little bit about that then.
Thank you, Osman. If we can go to the next slide. Remember that one of the things that we were interested in is this notion that past research suggests that behavior in the boardroom matters hugely in terms of board effectiveness, but also in terms of its ability to deal with the diversity in the room. And as much as we would have loved to be able to go into boardrooms, for good reason, boards aren't always able to do that. And of course, we started doing this and then the pandemic hit. So the best method is one that I've developed over the last 30 years of something called a Q-sort. 40 items, generally about how an organization is or a group is functioning. And you'll see we put one up here as an example. The board believes in a top-down, hierarchical, control-oriented style, rules, checks, and oversight, versus the board believes in a bottom-up style, few formal rules, strong committees rather than overall, and encourages director initiative. Now, those are the kind of questions that most of the people we interviewed would offer. They would stop and say, I haven't thought about that, right? And proceed to answer the question. So what the Q-sort did, especially because we have multiple perspectives, is allow us, we think, a pretty reasonable understanding of what the interactions are like within that boardroom based on multiple perspectives, people doing this Q-sort. So if we go to the next slide, well, I think what we want to do next is start to answer some of the core research questions.
Thank you, Randall. Yeah, so at this point, we would like to give you, a flavor of results. Obviously, the report goes into much more detail and provides a discussion around our findings, but just the headline points that we'd like to make. And I'll start with the first question: how have board effectiveness and dynamics been affected by gender and ethnic diversity of board membership? I suppose the first thing I'd like to mention before we actually go into any results is that the results of our statistical analysis and modeling are broadly in line with the findings in the existing literature on the link between diversity and firm performance, in the sense that not every single model we analyzed suggested a statistically significant relationship. However, getting back to the Osman's point on the method and the combination of qual and quant, the unique insights and perspectives of board members that we were able to collect during the in-depth interviews helped us to look beyond the result in each particular model and analyze and identify patterns that emerge when you look across the models. And these patterns tell us an absolutely fascinating story, not only about the effects of diversity on board effectiveness, but also about the path a board has to take to realize those benefits, and highlights the importance of both inclusion and actively managing the diversity. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Now I'll talk about the actual effects. So, for example, the evidence suggests that a greater gender diversity, and let's start with gender diversity, has a positive impact on financial performance as measured, for example, by EBITDA margin. However, that effect is not immediate, and it comes through 3 to 5 years later. What's even more important is that what we see from our analysis, that better performing companies, companies which generally perform better, are more able to realize those benefits. And this suggests that perhaps the management and leadership practices that they have in place that allow them to be successful in general also enable the benefits of diversity. Right, and this is further confirmed by our analysis of the effects on the highest stock returns, where we observe sizable benefits, both, well, sizable short-term and long-term benefits. And short-term benefits come from just initiating your diversity journey. In this particular case, I'm talking about appointing the first woman on the board, just, you know, getting the ball rolling, and even bigger, more sizable, but delayed benefits from reaching a particular critical mass. And that critical mass seems to be approximately around 1/3 of the board being women. However, the important point is that the journey between just starting starting to diversify your board and reaching critical mass, it's not a linear journey, and evidence suggests that simply increasing your diversity without making a change to your boardroom culture and the approach if you don't do that, if you don't change your boardroom culture, you may not be able to realize the benefits, or in fact, there may be some negative effects, both long-term and short-term. So when we saw those results, and that's by looking at the stock returns, you know, so your stock returns reflect what's happening in the boardroom. So when we saw these results, the next question we asked ourselves was, okay, what's that step change that's needed? And the analysis of the board profiles we did suggested that more diverse boards, more gender diverse boards, tend to put more emphasis on internal collaboration when they work together. And they also tend to put more emphasis on engagement with external stakeholders. And this does pay off. Our analysis of the shareholder descent data indicated that the boards which become more diverse over time tend to experience less shareholder descent as a result of that. Which is very, you know, it's an encouraging finding. At this point, I would also like to highlight the fact that even though at this point in time, pretty much every single FTSE 350 board has at least one woman on the board, it is also true that there are many much smaller companies out there which have not started or which have not embraced diversity yet, which highlights the importance of our research way beyond the FTSE 350 audience, and we hope that this report will be of interest to those companies, and they will engage in the diversity debate, and they will take action and contribute to and will make a step towards a more productive and prosperous future. In terms of the effects of ethnic diversity, so our ability to draw definitive conclusions on the effects of ethnic diversity on board effectiveness was limited mainly by the fact that at present, FTSE 350 boards are less ethnically diverse than they are gender diverse. And it is also true that there has been less change over time in terms of ethnic diversity. And if you want to analyze the effects of a change, you first have to observe the change. And also it is true that the data on ethnicity is just more limited because it's a more sensitive characteristic. At this point, we can say that we observe a weak positive relationship between an increase in ethnic diversity and a reduction in shareholder descent. So that's a good positive finding. And another very important finding that we definitely can confirm is that the boards which are diverse in terms of gender are not the same boards which are ethnically diverse as of now. And this suggests that the code for unlocking diversity that allows you to become diverse is actually different for different types of diversity. And now reports goes into more detail about those particular characteristics. And for example, we find that the boards which are more successful in achieving ethnic diversity have practices around more established and maintain practices around monitoring the pipeline, and great emphasis on inclusion, for example. But this is very important to keep in mind, that there are different types of diversity that we need to keep in mind, and achieving a true diversity in multiple directions or multiple dimensions does take an additional effort. So this was a short summary of our backward-looking results. So results on what effect a change or increase in diversity has had on board performance to date, but obviously forward-looking element is arguably even more important. So at this point, I'd like to hand over back to Randall, who is going to talk about that element of our research. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sergei. So I'm going to talk us through the next couple of research questions and some of the highlights. Again, lots more detail within the report itself, but these are the big, as it were, headlines. So our second research question was, what are the attributes, skills, and experiences that board members will need in the future? Now, it's important to understand that we asked this question before we asked any questions about diversity, either to define it or to comment on it in any way. So this reflects just broadly what boards think are the most important things for the future. So if we go to the next slide, I think there's a couple things here. First is some reassuring things on there. It's classic ideas like strategy and strategic thinking are very high on the list. Okay, so it makes sense. Not surprisingly, things like digital skills are very high on the list, right? That has become essential for most directors as well. But I think what's interesting is that the number one is adaptability and resilience in response to all these things that have been happening and the big shocks that we've been experiencing. And you have embracing diversity and interpersonal skills also getting pretty high up billing. So again, this suggests to me that boards are very aware of the need for diversity, the potential usefulness of diversity. Again, reinforcing the notion that it's not that boards don't understand that it's important. They may struggle sometimes with how they deliver. It's a complex task, getting all the pieces to line up when not many positions open. There are not many of them to go with, and you've got to find the right person with the right skills. And then when we add demographic diversity on top of that, it becomes an even more complex challenge. All right. I think if we go to the next slide, please, and we'll talk a little bit about research question 3, which is, what can nominations committees do to take a more diversity-friendly approach to recruitment? So if we now go to the next slide, look at the data here. There were 6 things that came up in any significant numbers. The first one, I think the first 2 or 3 are widely understood and well used. Choose the right search firm and providing a clear mandate. Most every board uses a search firm. I think the point of the nuance in this is that what directors were telling us is not to be afraid to switch firms if the firm you're working with, right, doesn't either have that demographic within its pool or struggles with diversity itself. And so what they were telling us is, you're going to need the support of outsiders to help build the network. Don't be scared to go to an additional one when you need to, and you may be working with 2 or 3 at the same time. The next item on there was about managing the pipeline of diverse talent. That was, who do we know in our networks? What can we build in our network? How can we manage the pipeline both within our firm, but within our personal networks, so that we have sight of good candidates who come from underrepresented backgrounds. And so when an opening does occur, this is somebody that we already have some idea, right, who may be helpful here in terms of filling a vacancy. 3, set clear targets and report regularly. And this really was for the entire board, not just the nominations committee. And to have that conversation about what do we mean about diversity. So set specific targets for specific groups. So instead of talking about diversity broadly, talk about very specifically, and talk about and set targets with a regular update on how we're doing. 4 was the importance of using a skill assessment. If you use experience, right? Experience, the traditional experience for board appointments are CFO or CEO onto a board. And if you look at the data, the CFO and CEO roles are overwhelmingly men. particularly white men. And it's actually, if you go by experience, it's very difficult to diversify. So define the skill sets you're using or looking for and allow candidates who don't come from that background exactly to make the case for why they have those skills that will be useful to your board. Next, be prepared to invest the time and energy in making diverse appointments. Basically, those who are most successful told us over and over and over. And as Sergei alluded to, it's a long-term game. It doesn't happen overnight. And it requires persistence over time, continuous effort over quite a long period of time in order to fully diversify a board. And then lastly, ensure that the nominations committee itself is diverse. Strangely enough, quite a number of people, the people who recommended it here to us, said observed that there's that too often candidates get overlooked because the nominations committee itself doesn't have as broad of a network, and there may be reasons why a minority candidate or director doesn't necessarily want to be on a nominations committee. On the other hand, those networks need to be picked up to be successful and run a more diversity-friendly recruitment process. So 6 things. A few I think are well known, and others are less well known, but I think highly effective, and in particular coming from boards that have been quite successful in diversifying. So if we could go then to, I think we go to the next slide. What I want to do here is just, this is our overall summary graphic here. You know, what leads to effectiveness in boards? There are all these pieces, and in the research we give you some data about what do chairs need to do, what do individual directors need to do, what should happen in nominations committee, and all the outside providers, board evaluators, educators, and regulators, what are the kind of things they can do as well. So I encourage you to look for that as because there are, all of these are important pieces for encouraging boards to be as effective as they possibly can be. So if we go to the next slide, we decided we would like to have a comment from someone who is a participant in the research and interested in it. And so we asked Anita Gray, who's chair of Direct Line, to comment here on this research. And we're pleased to say she did provide us with a short video that I think we will play now for you.
Congratulations to the FRC, London Business School and SQW in producing a report with real academic rigour that underpins the business case for diversity on boards and leadership teams, as well as this being the right thing to do. I think for me the findings reflect the experience that many of us will have had serving on more diverse boards or leadership teams, that with diversity comes a range of experience, of perspectives, thoughts, ideas and solutions that can help improve decision making, but also engender a genuinely inclusive culture that I think is increasingly important for the challenges and the degree of uncertainty that businesses face today. I think the report also serves to remind us all that diversity is a long-term set of activities that are quite complex, that require persistency and a continued refresh and reflection and maintenance of boards and board composition in order to ensure that we do continue to increase and improve our diversity at the board table. However, chairing diverse boards can sometimes be a bit more challenging to bring all those diverse perspectives into alignment and to make decisions. But my own experience is that the richness of that discussion and debate really does lead to improved decisions. And the benefits are clear and stated in the report that is published today. I think it helps us all to reflect and challenge ourselves to continue to learn about diversity and what we need to do to continue to improve it. And I, for one, will be taking lessons from the report as a result. Once again, thank you for providing such a stimulating report and another opportunity to pause for thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I mean, that gave a really good insight to not just how you went about the research, but what the results were as well, and gave a really good explanation, really good understanding. Now, we have got some really good questions coming in. They're a mixture of sort of general questions and technical questions. They're both interesting. The technical questions are actually quite interesting as well. I'm not necessarily going to take them in the order that they were delivered. I'm going to try and sort of mix it up a bit. And in fact, I think I'm going to start with the last question that we published here, which says that it was mentioned that the research shows that boards which adopt diversity of thought at a slower rate have stronger performance in the long term. So, which tends to suggest that investors are more supportive of a gradual approach. Probably a bit unfair, actually, to start with this last question. But do you think? How do you think that the pandemic and COVID-19 might have affected thought process on that? Do you think this trend will continue post-COVID? I know we've got to live with COVID for a long time, but as we emerge from it, do you think that directors' minds will be more focused on this? I'm not going to point the finger on this one. I'm going to ask if anyone would like to pop up and attempt an answer. If anyone has perhaps a more general view on, the thought processes that might come out of the pandemic and what we've been through in terms of board diversity and how boards and companies might think about diversity in their boards. Do you think that will be hastened?
Well, I can say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Randall.
I mean, to your earlier question, yeah, I mean, the changes that have happened over some time, and with each kind of diversification and change, right, there are new things to adapt to. And in fact, that's what our data show, is that success in one type of diversity doesn't necessarily lead to success in the next. So it isn't like there's a single magic pill to take. We all have our inclusion right, and suddenly, wow, it's all going to change. This is a long-term process. It will take time, but we need to be persistent if it's going to happen. And in doing so, we can see that there are benefits and rewards from doing so. COVID, of course, has set a whole new set of priorities around adaptability, resilience, and so on. And we know that that COVID has affected women and ethnic minority people more harshly than it has the white population and men, but I don't think at the board level that should be necessarily reflected in any kind in terms of problem in terms of recruiting qualified candidates. So in that sense, that diversification should continue and continue to provide increasing benefit.
And David, if I might be able to add to that, I think the thing that has been interesting for me in terms of emerging from the conversations, I guess touches a bit on the personality diversity that we found, and how now that the pandemic has moved us to a virtual platform, how certain board members or chairs feel that there's a different dynamic to virtual board meetings. So what I'm hearing is individuals again, board members, chair saying, I need to think differently about how I run my meetings, how I include people, how I might even need to pay more attention to styles where people prefer to reflect before they speak. So that, as an aside, that was interesting for me to hear from some of the folk that we spoke about how the pandemic might be influencing, what happens in the virtual boardroom per se.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that it's certainly affected those. I mean, I've written about side conversations on boards, and it's massively impacted the way those kind of conversations do and don't happen. And in some ways, that's a good outcome, because one of the things we know about operating in this way is it has a tendency to equalize contribution, because those who would tend to be a bit quiet want to assert themselves to make sure people are aware they're there and they're engaged, and those who talk a lot tend to need to listen a bit more when you're working in this way. So I think there could be some positive outcomes to it as well.
Thanks very much indeed. Now, there's a little bit of debate going on in the Q&A about what neurodiversity actually means. I don't want to dwell on that too much, but I'm assuming that it means in general, and I'm generalizing here, but please correct me if I'm wrong, different types of cognitive approach to problem solving, etc., etc. So I'm taking that in a sort of general sense. But there's an early question that if as Randall explained in his presentation, the research sets out that personal neuro and personality are top of mind when it comes to diversity, presumably to bring those different perspectives to the discussion in the boardroom. Did you get any impression at all from your research that whether boards were actually trying to measure cognitive diversity, and if you didn't, how very briefly, how might you go about that? Again, I'm sort of straying over to looking at Randall on this one, but anyone, please chip in.
Yeah, everybody talked about it. Nobody talked about how to measure it, other than their impressions and wanting people who could think differently, innovatively about problems. And so neuro is actually very specifically used, for example, by some directors talking about how dyslexia, which is a problem when you're when you're in a mainstream traditional school environment, also provides unique perspective on problems and actually could be the source of innovation in organizations. And so they literally use that word, I think, correctly for the right reason. And I think, for me, that's coming a long way from an era not that long ago when things like that were, would have been frowned upon to be different in that way. So I see it as positive, but I don't really see people measuring it.
I mean, just to add to that, I think one of the things we've suggested in the report is further research on the links between individual diversity, neurodiversity, your personality, and your demographic diversity as well. And generally, you would think, people from different backgrounds would generally have different perspective, and that is the case. But I think in terms of actually measuring it and getting to a more nuanced picture of it is quite essential. So, you could say somebody from an Asian or background or women, from a similar socioeconomic status might have the same views and perspectives as someone as the white counterpart, for example. So the complex relationship between individual diversity and your demographic diversity is key as well.
Thank you, Osman. Vyla, please do.
Yeah, just a quick add, David. I think it's also important for people to think about or try and access the data that exists on how to manage personality and neurodiversity. As social scientists, we're swimming in information and data around that issue. But I think often leaders or board members think, wow, how I deal with this is I just have to use my own devices. And there's a lot of information out there that can be accessed to help in terms of managing and making sure you're getting the best out of that neurodiversity aspect in terms of board conversations and board decisions.
Thanks, Vyla. I mean, it's completely clear that we need more work on this, because that's ultimately one of the key factors, again, bringing in these more fruitful board discussions. We've had a good question here about the role of investors. There's the questioner noted that they didn't see investors on the diagram of stakeholders which were influencing diversity on boards. And of course, the UK Corporate Governance Code and the UK Stewardship Code, which we're also responsible for, supposed to work together to actually encourage engagement on a wide range of factors, including diversity. Did investors come into the equation at all? Who can I? Here we go. Well, I think Randall.
I'm happy to have a go at that. One has to draw a line somewhere around how far out you go. So that was a line beyond which we didn't go. I would love to do so, because I think you're absolutely right, and the person who asked the question is absolutely right. They were going to play a very important role in this discussion. It was just kind of outside the boundaries of what we ended up looking at.
Thanks, Randall. And I suppose, in a sense, a follow-up to that question, and it might be just to do with the limitations of what we asked for in the first place. But do you think that the lack of other diversity metrics, I mean, besides gender and ethnicity, and of course you recognise the fact that it was difficult to collect some of the ethnicity data, do you think the lack of those diversity metrics had an impact on your findings overall?
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and one in which we also, of course, with the people that were interviewed, so that subsample of 25 companies, we're able to get good data on ethnicity and socioeconomic background. And the findings are, of course, because it's only the 25, they're quite intriguing, potentially powerful, but somehow we have to get better data on these things, because at the moment there's really nothing publicly available, and so people are, researchers are guessing from some very indirect indicators, and it would be so much more powerful if we actually had good data. So in our case, socioeconomic status, we asked about directors' parents, what jobs they had, where they did early education, and because those are the real indicators. And it turns out there are some very powerful things going on there amongst a small sample. And if we had better data, I think there's so much more we could learn about it.
Thanks, Randall. And well, we're always looking for new areas of research, particularly where we can develop policy when it comes to the Stewardship Code and Corporate Governance Code. So that's very interesting, and I'm sure you are too. We've got some good new questions coming in. The questioner noted that just 23% of the research respondents said that ensuring the nomination committee was itself diverse was an important action to take when recruiting. That seems, does seem quite low. What do you think that's do you think that's telling us anything significant? It sounds like it is. Without leading the answer.
Well, personally, I think people just haven't I take those kind of answers as here's a really good idea that, best practice, starts somewhere and starts to spread out, and it's the kind of thing that not enough boards are talking about, and I think in part because not enough of them are having a conversation about what do we mean by diversity in the main board, and following that up with setting some specific targets, right, and pursuing it right the way through with data. In general, boards need to do more of that and less pushing that out either to, we asked who's responsible ultimately for diversity in your board, and it's a topic I'm going to kind of pursue with much more rigor here, because what you see largely is if the board said everybody's responsible, but we don't have specific targets, that means nobody's responsible. Some were telling us the company secretary was responsible. Again, not very helpful. The ones that did well are where they said the whole board is responsible. We talk about it. We look at specific data. We set specific targets, and we all talking about it. Once a year, at least. Those boards are the ones that were doing well, and I think then something like this follows that.
And I guess I would, if I could, David, I would add, one of the things we're hoping that our report will do is stimulate, perhaps some unconscious bias that may exist in boards about how they form committees, who's on those committees, etc.
Thank you for that. That is important. There's a question around the different skills that board members think are required, and I suppose it's half directed at the FRC as well, because slide 14 shows that financial literacy was at 15% in terms of importance when it comes to boards and the knowledge required, skills required, sorry, on boards. Do you think that means that there's is that pointing to some kind of fundamental problem there, whereas you had clearly adaptability, clearly resilience, very important? Is the fact that financial literacy it's seemingly down at 15%, or it's saying something, or is that down to the way that you collected the data?
Well, personally, I think that's because finance dominates the boardroom right now. So I don't perceive it as a particularly high priority for the next generation, because I assume it's kind of baked in. Because again, a point we make in this report is that compared to 20 years ago, the percentage of people who have a background in finance has gone up really quite substantially, right? And so on the one hand, that's good in terms of financial management of our organizations. On the other hand, we do worry about the lack of representation of some of the other functional areas that are clearly relevant for running the business as well. And I think that's the reason that it sits down there. Me personally, maybe my colleagues may well have a different view.
Looks like we have agreement there. I'm going to have to call a halt, unfortunately, to the questions. I haven't been able to do justice to them. There are some interesting questions which we need to take on board. But before we finish, I'd just like to go around the table one more time and say, for each of you to say something, what action can you take out of this research now? What do you suggest that that boards and companies and maybe even investors should actually do as a result? Can we start with? I'm not sure whether we've got a particular order, so perhaps can we start with Sergei?
Well, yeah. Thank you, David. I think one takeaway for me, if I was to summarize the findings in one word and like what it means for going forward, I would choose the word time, because all change, well, you need to drive the change. That is not a question, but all change requires time, and we know for a fact that every single board and every single team is different, and as we mentioned before, that it is very unlikely that there will be a ready solution, a magic pill that you take and achieve great results. So it may take trial and error. You may be adaptive in what you do. So just in this diversity journey, to take into account that the benefits are not immediate, and that comes through in our results. It does take time.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Sergei. Osman.
It's about action, which is really focused on the inclusion piece and in the diversity and inclusion. So it's about the action to really implement effective policies that genuinely ensure inclusion. And whilst recognizing that, as Sergei says, there is going to be trial and error on the way. It's going to be long term. It's going to be complex. So it's not about just one and you're done kind of thing. It is much more long-term and nuanced about that. And, chairs and boards will get things not right first time round, but you don't give up, you keep on going and find a way through. But it is generally focusing on that inclusion piece.
Thanks, Osman. Don't be afraid to make mistakes and learn from the mistakes. I'm going to go to Randall. I'm going to finish with Vyla. Randall.
All right, thank you, David. My kind of single finishing thought is about the importance of listening. Listening is partly about building relationships with people. And in fact, it was the #1 predictor of boards that are successful with ethnic diversity was the chair being rated a really good listener by the other directors. Okay, that's how important that actually is. And it isn't just about listening to other people. You might learn something. You might, okay, but it's also about that communicates respect. It encourages others. It brings out the best in others. And so having particularly a chair, but all directors sometimes be in listening mode. That really struck me.
Thank you, Randall. And of course, the chair quite often is the chair of the NOMCO as well. So, and that's a really important link in your research. Vyla.
Yes, I guess my word would be curiosity, or increased curiosity. So, really encouraging board members, the chair, to be curious about what's being said, about not only what their colleagues are thinking, but also about what their colleagues are feeling, and not to assume that there's a shared understanding of concepts that are being discussed in the boardroom. And I often say to leaders who I'm working with, if you really want to practice that curiosity muscle, try for the next 2 weeks just asking 3 questions before you make a statement and see what happens.
That's a really important point to finish on Vyla, that encouraging that sort of thoughtful approach. Thank you very much indeed. Look, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a fascinating insight to the research and how you conducted it and what the results were. It doesn't stop here at all. We're going to carry on with our media and other social media campaign on this, and there will be further events during the autumn, because there's a lot more we need to draw out of this research, and we at the FRC need to learn from it too, in particular when we're thinking about the stewardship code and importantly the corporate governance code, about how we approach this subject matter. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry that we didn't get round to all of the questions, but I thought that was a really informative session. Thank you, and it's now 15:01, and I'll call it to a close. Goodbye.